I'm on the email list for Russ Vogt, who was, head of budget OMB under Trump.
Right.
And now he's one of the lead architects who he said what's happening is that Mike Johnson is breaking his promise, because he said before assuming the speakership that any Ukraine funding would be contingent on closing the border. And he said he's breaking his promise because we don't have the border funding. And so he supports the move to oust Speaker Johnson. Right. Do you agree that he broke that promise? And what do you think is going to happen if he does get removed again?
Well, I actually find what's happened over the last 48 hours while we're recording this to be quite extraordinary. I mean, number one, you had this, Mike Johnson getting religion on Ukraine, recognizing that this, in fact, was an existential threat to the left. It was also extraordinary to watch how many Republicans were willing to defy Donald Trump's opposition to this bill. And when the rule came up in front on the floor of the House of Representatives for this foreign aid package, it passed with more than 300 votes. I think it was 316 votes. So you have this huge bipartisan coalition in favor of all of this. Now, part of the disingenuousness of people like Russ Vogt is, of course, that you could have had the border bill, but he and his MAGA buddies killed it. So you can't. It's a little bit like somebody who goes in front of the judge and on charges of murdering their parents and pleading for mercy because they're an orphan. You guys killed this bill. So I hesitate to use the words profiles and courage, because these guys will always disappoint us. They will always break our heart. But Mike Johnson stood up there and said, okay, this is the right thing. He knows that it puts him on a slippery path. He knows that it might cost him his job, and he chose to do the right thing. Now, he chose to do the right thing after months and months and months of letting Ukrainians die because the weapons were drying up, but he did it. So at the moment, we are in this rather remarkable position of watching a quasi-coalition government. And it's kind of a flashback to what Congress looks like when it actually wants to not be dysfunctional, when it doesn't want to be directed by clowns like Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene, when they're serious about getting things done. Now, that probably won't last, but they took a break from dysfunction, and people like Russ Vogt want to put them back into dysfunction. I mean, if you really, really want to screw up the Republican Party, let's spend the next 6 months showing how uninterested they are in government by having a chaotic House of Representatives. Real men of political genius would plunge the House into that kind of chaos.
Well, my hope actually is that obviously the Ukraine bill passes because it's desperately needed. And I still don't, we're not even talking about people like J.D. Vance, but that there is MGT or one of the clowns does put up, or Massey or one of those people does put up the motion to vacate. And then Johnson has to rely on Democratic support to stay in power. And then, as you say, Charlie, then I think it's going to be mandatory bipartisanship, and there's a chance that more can get done.
I think that's the likeliest scenario at this point. Now, I mean, this is messy for everybody. I mean, Democrats are not going to want to save Mike Johnson. On the other hand, for Mike Johnson to lose his speakership because he did the right thing, I think would be an unfortunate picture. So again, we are in uncharted territory, and that's the story of 2024 over and over and over again. That anybody that tells you exactly what's going to happen this year is making that up, because there's no historical parallel. There's no historical model that you can say this is the way this plays out. And certainly what's happening in the House of Representatives now, part of this is just the math that Republicans now have a 2-vote margin.
Well, I think
with the
after
resignation
today,
of my fellow Wisconsinite.
Yeah. I was going to say after Mike
Gallagher, 2 votes.
Wow.
So given the number of Republicans who are utterly uninterested in actually serious governing, either the House of Representatives grinds to a halt and returns to complete, clown car dysfunction, or they come up with some sort of a bipartisan way of muddling through the rest of the year. And they can perhaps do that because I don't think that there's a lot of prospect of major legislation for the rest of the year. If they get this package through, that Democrats could perhaps throw a lifeline to Mike Johnson without necessarily giving anything up. But again, I don't know when we've seen anything like this, anything remotely like this.
Yeah. Go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, to your point on Democrats probably will not step in and save Mike Johnson, even though he did something good for Ukraine, because they didn't do that to Kevin McCarthy. Last year, when Kevin McCarthy, he pushed forward the bill to keep the government open to avoid a shutdown. And did the Democrats reward him? They rewarded him with the chopping block. So I don't expect there to be any love lost or continuing, I guess, from the Democrats for him. But I guess my bigger question is, because there's this, there's this specific fight on Ukraine and Israel and immigration, but I'd love to get your thoughts more broadly on U.S. debt overall, because we're now approaching almost $35 trillion in U.S. debt. And unfortunately, it's mind-blowing to me. Our U.S. debt interest payments are now $1 trillion annually. And a lot of it has to do with the hike in the interest rates that is spiking the borrowing costs for us. To me, this seems like a complete fiscal train wreck. And I understand the impulse by some on the right to want to stop the spending. To me, it seems they have a bone to pick about Ukraine. I have a bigger bone to pick in general about spending. Do you support actual fiscal restraints? Do you think there are any grown-ups who can stop this fiscal train wreck?
Well, they haven't so far, so I think that the default setting would be no. Republicans talk about the deficit except when they're in charge, and this is one of the the last 10 years have been this soul-crushing, disillusioning experience. And back in the day, in the before times, when I was on conservative talk radio in the state of Wisconsin, one of my very frequent guests was Paul Ryan. And probably 100 times, we talked about the looming debt crisis. And this was the most predictable crisis facing the country and the ruinous implications of that much debt. And then when Republicans had control of government, what did they do? They jacked up the deficit even more. So you have the spending problem, and then you also have a revenue problem. And so I'm not sure what the Republican plan is other than to cut taxes even more deeply. And I actually like tax cuts, but at some point you need to look at this and say, how much debt do we really want to add on? This is the greatest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history. And quite frankly, I don't see much seriousness on the part of either Republicans or Democrats to deal with this.
Well, and I would just add, the entitlements, no one's willing to touch them. And that's 75% of the budget. And so with the debt ceiling fight that happened almost a year ago, was basically over 1/6 of the budget, right? Because now defense is off the table, and plus a quarter of our debt has to be refinanced in the next 12 months. So that's going to make it worse. So by 2025, the interest on the debt will pass Social Security as the biggest expense. And again, I don't see any effort in Congress by either party. It's the old saying that all politicians love to spend. The Democrats just admit it. And I think that's what you're seeing here. So I don't see how, unless there's someone that comes in with significant political capital, and in such a closely divided country, I don't see how it's going to happen. I don't know about you. And
of course, this is the problem, that you're not going to be able to tackle those issues without some sort of a bipartisan approach to it. In the past, when they've tried to do it, they would come up with bipartisan commissions. And the reason they do that is nobody wants to jump off this cliff without, a loan. And one of the great innovations, of course, of Trumpist republicanism, when Donald Trump came along, was when he announced that he was not in favor of any of the kinds of entitlement reforms that people like Paul Ryan had been talking about for years. So, and frankly, that helped him win the nomination. It helped him win the presidency, that he will not touch Social Security or Medicare. Now, this, again, is going to be one of the flashpoints in the election, because, of course, Democrats will try to say, don't trust the Republicans. They will try to cut it. And my guess is that Donald Trump will try to neutralize this issue the way he tried to neutralize the abortion issue by once again saying that he has no intention of reforming these entitlement programs. So there we're at. So if Donald Trump is going to return to power, it will be no entitlement reform and probably more significant tax cuts. I'm not sure how that reduces the deficit.
Yeah.
Well, I think from just a language standpoint, I don't even like the word entitlement, because I don't think the only thing we're entitled to is God's love, as far as I'm concerned. But everything else is up for debate in terms of funding. But I'm with you, Charlie. I at one point during the main stage in 2016 of CPAC did an interview on the main stage there with Paul Ryan on issues around welfare reform and poverty and conservatives' approaches to the safety net. And that's really where I think when people say, oh, I'm socially liberal but fiscally conservative, you can't be one or the other. Like, there's a whole continuum of these programs that are fiscally unsustainable because you're socially liberal. And in the end, you're actually destroying the very families you're trying to benefit. That's what the research of people have shown over and over. People like Jason Riley at the Wall Street Journal, and Walter Williams, the economist. So in any case, I agree with you, Charlie, that it's gonna. I mean, that's how in 1984 with Bill Clinton, he had a Republican Congress. That's how they got a lot of these welfare reforms across the finish line. I don't see those type of figures today. I don't see Joe Biden going across the aisle. Is there a version of Joe Biden that could become like Bill Clinton of 94? And if so, who would be the figure in Congress that would do that?
Well, we are so far away from all of that. I think one of the big questions is, what does the Democratic Party look like after Joe Biden? I mean, I know that Republicans have convinced themselves that Joe Biden is this radical woke figure. The reality is that, he beat Bernie Sanders and he beat Elizabeth Warren. And I think his instincts are centrist, but that does not mean that the next in line will also be that kind of a person. Actually, Joe Biden in many ways was the ideal person to cut those kinds of deals because of his background in the Senate. Now, it didn't work out because, look, we don't live in an age where people value and the incentive structure does not reward compromise and that kind of governance. This would have been a moment to do that. So I honestly don't know the answer to that question. So, what is the old adage that something that can't go on forever won't? At a certain point, there will be this fiscal cliff. There will be this moment when Social Security runs out of money and somebody has to take some action. And I think that the political class right now is just basically saying, yeah, as long as it doesn't happen on my watch, as long as I don't have to fix it, I'm okay. But sooner or later, the clock runs, right? You're going to have to figure out, how do you pay for Medicare? How do you pay for Social Security? And none of those decisions are going to be painless. I mean, I think we all know what has to happen. And I think it's doable. In terms of like Social Security, raising the age and, perhaps changing the benefits for people who are, not anywhere close to getting it. But I don't know I have never really met a politician that wants to be the one who casts that vote.